Okay, tell me your name. Tell me what you do.
My name is Andrew Biggs. I'm a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C.
Okay, and tell me about the study you just did.
Well, the point of the study is to look at the relative levels of compensation for public sector workers and public sector workers in Ohio relative to similar employees in the private sector. What we mean to do when we say similar is we try to look at private sector workers who have the same levels of education, experience, and other attributes as Ohio public sector workers. The reason we do that is sometimes people look at public sector pay, they see that it's high, they say, oh, they must be overpaid, they have higher salaries than the average private sector worker. But then the public sector employees will come back and say, look, we're more educated on average, we have more experience, so we should be paid more. And that's a good point. What we want to know is how much more should they be paid. And by controlling for the differences between the two workforces, we can get some feeling for that.
So you're looking at apples to apples.
That's the point. We're trying to look at apples to apples. Some other studies do apples to oranges, and it just doesn't tell you very much. So what we try to do here is look at three areas of compensation. If you think about what public sector unions push for, the three main things are salaries, benefits, and job security. And all three of those things have value, and we try to put a value on them and compare them to what people in the private sector get. And this is an important thing in this sort of the overall picture of SB5, in the sense that some folks have argued that public sector workers in Ohio are underpaid or they're just around fairly paid. And so if SB5 took place, that could push down their wages, which would both be unfair to them, but could also make it harder for the government to attract and retain quality employees. On the other hand, though, if public sector workers are receiving a premium, if they're overpaid relative to similar private sector workers, then reducing their pay over time could be both fair and could produce savings for the budget, in the sense that your labor costs will be lower, but you won't have problems with attrition because people will still stay on the job. So we try to look at salaries, benefits, and job security in turn. The salaries, in a sense, are the easiest thing to do. We have good data from the Census Bureau does a survey called a Current Population Survey, which contains individual level data, has data about individual workers. And from that we know their wages, we know whether they work for the government or the private sector, we know their age, their education, a whole range of other attributes. When you put all this data together, you can use statistical analysis to determine, or to estimate at least, what is the relative pay of public versus private sector employees after controlling for all the differences between the workforce. What we find is that public sector workers in Ohio receive a slight pay penalty when it comes to salaries alone. Their salaries are around 2.5% below those paid to similar workers in the private sector. It's very common across the country for state and local government employees to have a salary penalty. On average, it's around 9 or 10% across the country. So the salary penalty exists in Ohio, but it's actually smaller than in most other states. So salaries are, there's a small penalty, but they're roughly even between public and private sector workers. That's when we go on to benefits. And benefits, people know benefits are an important part of compensation even in the private sector, but they're even more important in the public sector. And we use data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to estimate the value of benefits relative to salaries. We could say, for instance, that private sector workers in large firms in Ohio receive on average benefits equal to around 40% of their salaries. So for each dollar of salary you receive, you get benefits worth around 40 cents. And so we try to estimate that for public sector employees as well. In general, this is a fairly straightforward thing to do, but there's two areas in which things get tricky and we've had to make some adjustments. The first is that public sector employees, most of them become eligible to receive retiree health care. If they retire before the Medicare age of 65, they're eligible to receive subsidized health coverage from their employer, the government. That's very rare in the private sector, and where it does exist in the private sector, it does tend to be less generous. The Bureau of Labor Statistics data we use doesn't include anything on retiree health care. So you have to include that. To get the value of that coverage, we rely on accounting disclosures the government is required to make. The presents the value of retiree health coverage, we estimate it's equal to around 6% of wages. So it's not the most valuable retiree health coverage in the country. Something like California is quite a bit more than that, but still it's more than what the typical private sector worker would get. The second point is that the BLS data we use when it comes to pensions records only what employers contribute towards pensions. It doesn't tell us directly what the employee will receive. And that's an important distinction between the public and private sector, because public and private sector pensions fund their benefits very differently. Public sector pensions tend to make low contributions, which they invest in risky assets. Now that risk isn't borne by the employee, it's borne by the government and by the taxpayer. But we have to account for the methods they use to fund their pensions in order to get an accurate view of the actual benefits people receive. If you don't do this, you'll simply get the wrong answer. By doing that, what we show is that the pensions in the public sector are really much, much more generous than what the typical private sector worker would get. And that's really a driving factor in the overall compensation picture for public sector versus private sector workers. The pensions are just much, much more generous.
How much more? I mean, do you have a percentage just you put on it? Or?
I would say probably pensions alone, probably 4 times more generous. When you add in Social Security, which private sector workers participate in, but public sector workers don't, you're probably looking twice as generous. So that's a big deal. That's a very big issue, or a big factor in this. What we find is that private sector workers working, and we restrict to larger firms because larger firms tend to pay better salaries and better benefits. So both on the salaries and the benefits end, we're not comparing to all private sector workers out in Ohio. We're comparing to the ones who tend to work in larger firms. So we're comparing Ohio public sector employees to a relatively well-paid subsection of the private sector workforce. So in a sense, this is a conservative estimate. But private sector workers, on average, receive benefits equal to around 40% of their salaries. We find that public sector workers in Ohio receive benefits equal to around 88% of their salaries. So basically, the salaries are very similar. There's a slight advantage for the private sector, but benefits in the public sector are about twice as generous as they are in the private sector. That's a big driver of things. When you combine the salaries and the benefits together, we find that public sector employees receive a compensation premium of around 31% over similar private sector workers with similar skills and education working in larger private sector firms. The third thing we look at is job security. Everybody knows job security has a value. If you make any effort to reduce job security in the public sector, it's obviously a very big issue for them, but it's been hard to quantify the value of that job security. The job security has value in 2 ways. First is, if you lose your job, you go through a period, usually around 18 or 20 weeks, when you're looking for a new job. Now, you can collect unemployment during that period, and we factor that in, but your wages and your income is going to drop while you're looking for a new job. The second issue, though, is if your job is already paying you a premium, if you're in the public sector and you're getting a 31% wage and benefit premium, if you lose your job in the public sector, you're likely to find a new private sector job at a lower rate of pay. So it's also protecting you against that. So there's really 2 aspects of it. The first aspect, just protecting against unemployment, we estimate that's worth about an extra 2% to pay. We think that's a pretty conservative estimate there. When you add the fact that job security is protecting a pay premium, it increases that value of job security to around 9% of pay. We think about this. If I were to ask you, how much salary would you be willing to give up in order to have the job security of a public sector employee, the idea of 9% or so doesn't sound outrageous to people. So we think it is a difficult issue to get on top of precisely, but we think it's a good issue. it's a decent estimate of where we stand. Other folks who looked at it have essentially ignored the value of job security, and we think it's important. When you add that on to the previous premium of 31%, you get a total compensation premium of around 43%. What that tells you is that public sector employees in Ohio, on average, receive a total compensation package of salaries, benefits, and job security worth around 43% more than what they'd be likely to receive in private sector employment at market wages. So that's a pretty big pay difference there. One question comes up is how would SB5 affect this? And there's certain things we can say, certain things we can't say. One aspect of SB5 is the pension pickup, where some employers would pick up the pension contributions for their employees. We assumed in our analysis that every employee paid the full contribution for their pensions, that there was no pension pickup. So this 43% figure essentially assumes that that aspect of SB5 is already implemented. The second part is a requirement to pay more in health care costs for public sector employees. We don't have a precise estimate of the effects. My guess is that putting that in place would reduce the pay premium by maybe 5%. So it would have an effect, no doubt, but going from 43% down to 38 or 39% is not an enormous difference. Now, over the longer term, parts of SB5 that weaken collective bargaining rights, things like that, that could have some sort of dynamic effect in terms of changing the relative bargaining strengths of units of government relative to labor, and that could have an effect on wages, benefits, job security over time. So that could work to shrink the overall compensation premium. I am very skeptical that by itself that could take your 43% pay premium down to zero. The reason I'm skeptical is that there, in the public sector around the country, there are employees who are unionized, who have collective bargaining rights, and there are employees who are non-unionized, who simply don't have them at all. The unionized workers do receive a modest pay premium over the non-unionized workers, but it is not very big. I'm guessing around 6 or 7% of salaries. So in effect, even if SB5 eliminated all collective bargaining rights, all union rights in Ohio, which it doesn't do, the numbers indicate the effects on pay would be significant but still modest relative to the size of the overall compensation premium we've seen. In the private sector, there's a big difference between salaries paid to unionized workers versus non-unionized workers. There is a difference there in the public sector, but it's much smaller. So even if SB5 is fully implemented, my guess is that public sector employees in Ohio will still have a pretty significant pay premium over private sector workers. So you're not going to have to worry that much about an inability to recruit people, retain people. You're not going to have a huge attrition problem, is my guess. So I think that in terms of how I see the picture, that basically summarizes it. But certainly I'm happy to kind of follow up with any questions.
But the other side of this, I mean, they have their own studies in hand that show the exact opposite. The public sector workers aren't getting paid more. They're saying union workers have taken concessions, they're taking pay cuts, that kind of thing. Why is this study any better than any study that they put out?
Well, there is a study out that looked from the Economic Policy Institute, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C. And it uses some similar, very similar methods to what we use in our study. And so a lot of it, I don't have any disagreement. Their analysis of salaries is very similar to what we come up with. But there's three main problems with that approach. First is it excludes or ignores the value of retiree health coverage, which we do include. We think that's an important part of compensation. It's a big deal in the public sector. It's not a big deal in the private sector. The second issue is they significantly understate the value of public sector pension benefits because they don't adjust for the different funding rules and funding strategies that public and private sector pensions use. That study that I'm referring to, if you had two workers, one public sector, one private sector, who would receive the exact same pension benefits in retirement, their approach would say that the public sector worker receives lower pension compensation than the private sector worker, because the public sector employer would contribute less today in order to fund it. But what we care about isn't the funding strategy used by a pension. What we care about is the actual benefits that are promised and guaranteed to those workers. Our method says if two workers get the same guaranteed benefits in retirement, we credit them with the same pension compensation today. Their approach, I think, is just simply mistaken on this. I think it was an honest error, but I think it's just mistaken. Third is we calculate a value of job security for public sector employees. They don't. I think everyone will acknowledge job security has value. Everybody also acknowledges that it is difficult to measure. So we're not saying that ours is the be all and end all, down to the last decimal that we have it right. But we know the value of job security isn't zero, and some of these other studies effectively say that it has no value whatsoever. So those three things of retiree health coverage, pensions, and job security, we include values for those. Some other studies don't. That drives the main difference.
I see. So does Senate Bill 5 go far enough if local governments, state government, are really going to save much money in all of this?
Well, it's really hard to say because you don't know the dynamics down the road. The big issues, I think, with Senate Bill 5 and with sort of the sort of labor versus government issues around the country aren't so much on direct impacts on pay and benefits as they are on changing the relative bargaining strengths of government, particularly local government, relative to public sector unions. That's very hard to predict how it will play out down the road. I do suspect, even in the long term, even if SB5 is fully implemented, that there's going to be a pay premium in the public sector.